The call came in early one evening. It was Ashley's family, frantic and miles away in Canada, reporting a series of concerning messages from their daughter who had traveled to Chelmsford, England. A young woman, just 19, full of life and hope, had decided to chase what seemed to be a fairy tale romance. But something felt off. As an investigator, I've learned to trust those instincts, the gnawing feeling that something isn't right. And with each call and detail that emerged, the threads of this case began to unravel into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Ashley Wadsworth. That was the name attached to the inquiry. Born in Vernon, British Columbia, she was described by those who knew her as vibrant, adventurous, and deeply kind. Her life in Canada had been one of closeness, a large extended family, and a love for the outdoors. Yet her story didn't start in England. It began years earlier when, as a young girl, she met a boy online. Jack Seel. That was the name tied to the other half of this tragedy. A native of Essex, England, with a troubled history of familial estrangement and behavioral issues, Jack's life stood in stark contrast to Ashley's. He lived with his mother and stepfather in a small town, struggling with unemployment and an unsettled life. Yet, through the screen of their digital interactions, he seemed to offer Ashley the promise of romance and adventure. For 6 years, their relationship developed through messages, video calls, and occasional gifts sent across the ocean. Jack's charm, one that masked a darker, possessive nature, seemed to enthrall Ashley. Over time, her family began to notice the intensity of the connection. Jack tattooed her name on his arm, showered her with gifts, and increasingly tried to control her interactions with others. Red flags, perhaps. But love often blinds the best of us. In late 2021, Ashley made a bold decision. She booked a flight to the United Kingdom, leaving behind her family, friends, and the familiar comfort of home. It was her first trip overseas, and by all accounts she was thrilled. Her family, while apprehensive, supported her decision, believing in her independence and trusting that she could handle herself. When she arrived in Chelmsford, the early days seemed idyllic. Photos of Ashley and Jack appeared on her social media, smiling, exploring the city, and celebrating their long-awaited reunion. Friends and family back home took comfort in her cheerful updates. But for those of us who study the hidden depths of human behavior, those smiles can often mask storms brewing just beneath the surface. Jack's apartment, where Ashley stayed, was modest, a public housing flat in a less desirable part of the city. Yet Ashley seemed undeterred. She was here for love for Jack and for the possibility of a life together. At least, that's what she believed. It didn't take long for the cracks in Jack's facade to appear. Reports suggest that Jack's controlling behavior began almost immediately. He grew reclusive, refusing to leave the apartment and isolating Ashley from the outside world. He forbade her from attending church services or meeting new people, including a group of American missionaries she had connected with before her trip. When Ashley confided in them, her messages spoke of a love fraught with tension, control, and increasingly disturbing incidents. The first documented sign of physical abuse came just 6 weeks into her visit. Jack admitted to striking Ashley in a fit of jealousy, angered by messages he found on her phone. Ashley's attempts to minimize the incident to present a picture of happiness to her family only deepened the silence surrounding the abuse. By the time we were called in, the picture was clear: a young woman, isolated and trapped, clinging to a version of love that had long since turned dangerous. The threads were beginning to unravel, but the deeper we dug, the more we realized just how tightly they had been wound. This was no ordinary romance. It was a labyrinth of obsession, manipulation, and violence. Our investigation into Ashley's past, her connection with Jack, and the early days of her visit painted a chilling picture of a young woman ensnared in something far darker than she could have ever imagined. And as I prepared to delve deeper into the case, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, not just for Ashley, but for anyone else Jack's darkness might touch. By the time we pieced together Ashley Wadsworth's life in Chelmsford, it was clear that her dream of love had turned into something far more harrowing. Jack Seel, once the charming boy she'd adored from across the Atlantic, was no longer just a troubled partner. He was a captor, his affection twisting into control and violence. The first police reports we reviewed from Jack's past painted a pattern, a history of abusive relationships, coercive behavior, and violent outbursts. His anger wasn't new, it had always been there, simmering under the surface. Ashley, like others before her, had been drawn into a web of manipulation, hoping her love could soothe the tempest within him. In the weeks following her arrival, the cracks in their relationship widened. Jack's temper flared with increasing frequency, often triggered by perceived slights or imagined betrayals. During one incident, he struck Ashley over a trivial argument. Another time, he smashed a beer glass over her head, leaving her bruised and shaken. These weren't the actions of a frustrated lover, they were calculated eruptions of control. Despite everything, Ashley stayed. We've seen it before, victims of abuse trapped by a cycle of hope and fear, believing they can fix what is fundamentally broken. She confided in her sister Haley, admitting the extent of the violence but refusing to leave. She loved him, she said. She believed in him. And she couldn't bear to think of what might happen to him if she left. Her sister Haley tried to intervene from across the ocean, begging Ashley to come home. But Jack's grip was relentless. He convinced Ashley that she was the only one who could save him, the only person who truly understood him. And so, despite her family's pleas, she stayed. The day before everything unraveled, Ashley finally decided she'd had enough. Haley had called their mother, unable to keep the secret any longer. Together, they persuaded Ashley to book a return flight. She told Jack she was leaving. At first, he seemed to accept it, even agreeing to drive her to the airport. But something about his demeanor didn't sit right. His calm felt forced, brittle, like a dam holding back a flood. The morning of February 1st began with an argument. Jack, convinced that Ashley had been unfaithful, demanded access to her phone. A neighbor later told us they heard shouting through the walls, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor. Moments later, Ashley appeared at her neighbor's door, bleeding and visibly shaken. "He's angry," she told them. "He threw my phone and hurt our puppy." The neighbor wanted to call the police, but Ashley begged them not to. She still believed she could de-escalate the situation, that she could reason with Jack. Reluctantly, the neighbor let her return to the apartment. It would be the last time anyone saw Ashley alive. The timeline from here is murky but grim. By late morning, Ashley was texting friends and family, pleading for help. She messaged the missionaries she'd met before her trip, writing, "It's an emergency." But none of the messages went through in time. The apartment had turned into a sealed-off chamber, a place where Jack's rage would reach its boiling point. Between 12:30 and 1 p.m., the unthinkable happened. Jack attacked Ashley with a ferocity that defied comprehension. First, he strangled her until she stopped breathing, but his rage didn't subside. Grabbing a knife, he stabbed her repeatedly over 90 times, turning the apartment into a blood-soaked nightmare. By the time we arrived on the scene, the details of what happened next were chillingly clear. Jack, unbothered by the carnage around him, went about his day as though nothing had happened. He played video games, changed his social media profile picture to one of himself and Ashley, and even recorded a video message confessing to what he had done. In the footage, Jack sat next to Ashley's lifeless body. His words were calm, almost detached, as he spoke of love and regret. But his actions told a different story, one of a man consumed by control, incapable of letting go even in death. By the time Ashley's family woke up in Canada and began piecing together her desperate messages, it was too late. Jack had already carried out the final act of his twisted obsession. And as we stood in that apartment, surrounded by the aftermath, the question that haunted us was, how had it come to this? How had a young woman so full of life been silenced so brutally, so needlessly? In the end, the only answers lay in the darkness of Jack's mind, a place we were now determined to uncover. The investigation delved deeper into Jack Seel's past, uncovering a pattern of behavior that was as disturbing as it was revealing. Every file, every witness statement painted a picture of a man whose charm masked a long history of control, aggression, and manipulation. It started with his teenage years, where Jack's interactions with others already hinted at something darker. In 2014, at just 15 years old, he had entered into a toxic relationship with a girl he met online. When she ended things, Jack retaliated by hacking her social media accounts and posting explicit photos of her, a calculated move designed to humiliate and exert power over her. The court issued a restraining order, but it wasn't enough to stop him. Within weeks, Jack violated it, reaching out to her again with thinly veiled threats and promises that she could never escape him. This cycle of violence escalated in his home life. The same year, an argument with his mother over his Xbox spiraled into physical violence. Jack pushed her to the ground and tore a door off its hinges in a fit of rage. He was arrested and briefly detained, but it became clear that Jack's temper was beyond anyone's control. By the time he was 18, Jack's relationships had become increasingly volatile. In 2020, one of his ex-partners filed complaints of assault and false imprisonment. She detailed how Jack had locked her in his apartment, refusing to let her leave, and subjected her to physical abuse when she tried to resist. The charges were dropped when the victim declined to testify, but Jack's actions left scars that could not be erased. Another woman came forward that same year, recounting her own harrowing experience. Jack had choked her during an argument, cutting off her ability to breathe. She managed to escape his grip and flee the apartment, but again, no charges were filed. The lack of legal consequences emboldened Jack, allowing him to continue his reign of terror unchecked. The details of these cases were chilling, but they also illuminated a critical failure in the system. Jack's criminal history was extensive, yet it had not been shared widely enough to warn potential victims like Ashley Wadsworth. When her family searched his name online before her trip to the UK, nothing alarming surfaced. There was no indication of the danger she was walking into. Ashley's family, still reeling from her murder, learned of Jack's violent past during the trial. Each new revelation was a blow. They listened in horror as prosecutors recounted his history, realizing that Ashley had been just one in a long line of women Jack had terrorized. Her parents, Kenneth and Christy, were particularly struck by how familiar the story sounded. The isolation, the jealousy, the escalation to violence, it was a pattern that repeated itself, leading to Ashley's tragic death. Jack's ex-partners described him as controlling and paranoid, a man whose need for dominance knew no bounds. He had a way of luring women in with his charm, only to trap them in a web of manipulation once he had gained their trust. One ex-partner told investigators that Jack would isolate her from her friends and family, ensuring that she relied on him completely. Any perceived slight, no matter how minor, could set him off. It was like walking on eggshells, she said. You never knew what would trigger him. The more we uncovered about Jack's past, the clearer it became that Ashley's murder was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of unchecked violence, enabled by a system that had failed to hold him accountable. The restraining orders, the arrests, the warnings, they had all been temporary roadblocks that Jack easily circumvented. As investigators, we couldn't help but wonder how many red flags had been ignored, how many opportunities to stop Jack had been missed. And how could a man with such a history of violence have been allowed to continue harming others? The evidence painted a picture of a man who thrived on control, whose sense of entitlement made him believe he had the right to dominate those around him. It wasn't just Ashley's life that had been destroyed. Her family, her friends, and even the women who had come before her were all left grappling with the aftermath of Jack's actions. This part of the investigation was perhaps the most difficult. It wasn't just about gathering facts. It was about coming to terms with the systemic failures that had allowed a predator like Jack Seel to operate for so long. For Ashley's family, knowing the truth brought some clarity, but it also deepened their grief. They couldn't help but think that if someone, anyone, had intervened sooner, Ashley might still be alive. The days leading up to Ashley Wadsworth's tragic death revealed a heartbreaking picture of a young woman trapped in a toxic and violent relationship, holding on to a fragile hope that things might improve. Despite Jack Seel's escalating behavior, Ashley fought to believe that the man she had fallen in love with, the boy she had known for years online, could still be redeemed. Witness testimonies and digital records painted a vivid narrative of Ashley's final moments. On January 31, 2022, just 2 days before she was scheduled to return to Canada, Ashley confided in her family that she wanted to come home. The 6-month tourist visa that had brought her to England was nearing its expiration, and Ashley was ready to leave Jack and the volatile life she had been enduring. Her family immediately arranged for her flight, encouraging her to prioritize her safety above all else. That evening, Ashley informed Jack of her decision to leave, though he appeared to accept her departure, agreeing to drive her to the airport and accompany her for a required COVID-19 test. Tensions were palpably high. Jack's temper, which had flared violently in the past, seemed dangerously close to boiling over. Ashley's family, aware of his history of abuse, warned her to remain vigilant and, if necessary, leave for the airport immediately to avoid further conflict. But Ashley stayed, perhaps believing that her departure would pass without incident. Her mother, Christy, spoke to her late into the night, urging her to prioritize her safety. Ashley reassured her family that she would leave on February 3rd, as planned, but the undertone of fear in her voice left them deeply unsettled. Her sister Haley, who had been privy to the worst of Jack's violent outbursts, begged Ashley to escape as soon as possible. Ashley, however, was torn between her desire to go home and her lingering hope that Jack might change. The following morning, February 1st, Jack's rage erupted once more. A heated argument broke out between the couple, with Jack accusing Ashley of infidelity and demanding access to her phone. At approximately 8 a.m., one of Jack's neighbors heard Ashley's screams through the shared wall of their apartment complex. The cries for help were followed by a sudden silence, which the neighbor would later describe as deeply unsettling. Moments later, Ashley appeared at a neighbor's door, barefoot, crying and bleeding from a cut on her hand. She explained that Jack had flown into a jealous rage after misinterpreting a photo on her phone. In his anger, he had smashed her phone and thrown their puppy against the wall. The neighbor, alarmed by Ashley's injuries and emotional state, urged her to leave the apartment immediately. However, Ashley refused, pleading with the neighbor not to call the police. Her fear of Jack's retaliation was evident, but so too was her reluctance to escalate the situation. The neighbor briefly confronted Jack, who apologized and appeared calm. Believing that the immediate danger had passed, the neighbor left for an appointment. Meanwhile, Ashley returned to the apartment, where the situation continued to spiral. Ashley attempted to reach out for help, sending text messages to her family and friends in both Canada and England. She contacted her church community in Chelmsford, describing the situation as an emergency and begging for assistance. Tragically, due to time zone differences and connectivity issues, many of her messages were not seen until hours later. At approximately 11:22 a.m., Ashley sent a final round of messages, pleading for someone to intervene. By 12:45 p.m., however, it was too late. Jack, overcome with rage, strangled Ashley until she stopped breathing. Unsatisfied, he retrieved a knife from the kitchen and stabbed her over 90 times in a frenzied attack. The brutality of the assault left investigators stunned. The sheer number of wounds spoke to a level of rage that defied comprehension. What followed was a chilling display of Jack's cold detachment. After murdering Ashley, he went about his day as though nothing had happened. He changed his social media profile picture to one of himself and Ashley, captioning it with the possessive words, "Always mine." He even recorded a video message addressed to Ashley's sister Haley, expressing his twisted love for Ashley and offering a disjointed apology. In the background of the video, Ashley's lifeless body was partially visible. Jack also inflicted superficial wounds on his own chest, a likely attempt to fabricate a self-defense narrative. However, the overwhelming evidence against him, including his own video confession, left little room for ambiguity. Ashley's family, unaware of the tragedy unfolding thousands of miles away, awoke to a series of frantic messages from her. Unable to reach her, they contacted friends in Chelmsford and pleaded for someone to check on her well-being. One friend arrived at Jack's apartment but received no response at the door. Growing increasingly concerned, the friend called the police. At 4:13 p.m., officers entered the apartment. What they discovered inside would haunt them. Ashley's body lay in a pool of blood, bearing the horrific marks of Jack's final outburst. Jack himself, covered in blood, was arrested on the spot. He confessed to the murder, claiming a psychotic episode as his excuse. Toxicology reports would later reveal traces of cannabis and therapeutic levels of anti-anxiety medication in his system, hardly enough to substantiate his claims of diminished responsibility. Ashley Wadsworth's final hours were a testament to her strength and resilience. Despite the terror she faced, she fought to protect herself and sought help from those she trusted. Her death, however, underscored the devastating consequences of unchecked abuse and the failures of those around her to recognize the severity of the danger she was in. As the case against Jack Seel unfolded, the harrowing details of Ashley Wadsworth's tragic death came to light, leaving her family, friends, and community in shock and grief. Jack's trial was swift, the evidence against him overwhelming. His own confession, the brutal nature of Ashley's injuries, and the video he recorded after her death left no room for doubt. On October 10, 2022, Jack was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 23 years. In the courtroom, Ashley's parents sat with heavy hearts, listening to the prosecutor recount the chilling sequence of events. For them, this was not just about justice for their daughter, it was about making sense of an unthinkable act. They learned details about Jack's past that had been hidden from them, His violent history, including restraining orders, previous assaults, and coercive behavior, painted a portrait of a dangerous man. It was a past that, had they known, might have saved Ashley's life. During the sentencing, the judge condemned Jack's actions as calculated and cruel. The court heard how Jack had a long history of manipulation and violence toward women, behaviors that escalated until they culminated in Ashley's murder. In his written statement to Ashley's family, Jack expressed remorse, but his words rang hollow against the backdrop of his horrifying crime. Following the trial, Ashley's family returned to Canada with her remains, repatriated through the help of a community crowdfunding campaign. Her funeral, held on February 23, 2022, was a somber but heartfelt tribute to her life. Friends, family, and strangers who had been touched by her story gathered to honor her memory. Funds raised beyond the funeral expenses were donated to a scholarship foundation and a domestic violence support organization, ensuring that Ashley's legacy would contribute to protecting others. In Vernon, British Columbia, Ashley's family and friends worked tirelessly to bring awareness to the dangers of domestic abuse. Her sister Haley spoke openly about the signs of abuse Ashley had endured and the emotional isolation that kept her in the relationship. Her parents campaigned for better access to information about individuals with histories of violence, questioning why Jack's extensive criminal record wasn't accessible to those who might have been able to protect Ashley. The family also highlighted the importance of Clare's Law, a UK policy that allows individuals to request information about a partner's criminal history. Ashley's mother lamented that she had not been aware of this resource. She urged other families to educate themselves and take proactive steps to safeguard their loved ones. In the months following Ashley's death, her family noticed small but comforting signs they believed were messages from her. Lights flickered inexplicably, and doors opened and closed on their own. To them, these moments were reminders of Ashley's presence and the love she continued to share with them. Ashley Wadsworth's story resonated far beyond her community. Her death became a stark reminder of the dangers of domestic violence and the need for greater awareness and intervention. Advocates for women's safety drew attention to the patterns of control and abuse that often precede such tragedies, urging society to take these warning signs seriously. As Jack serves his life sentence, Ashley's family remains committed to honoring her memory. They have called for stricter measures to prevent abusers like Jack from finding new victims and have worked to create lasting change through advocacy and education. In the end, Ashley Wadsworth is remembered not for the tragedy that ended her life, but for the joy, kindness, and love she brought to everyone she knew. Her vibrant spirit and adventurous heart left an indelible mark on those who loved her. Though her life was cut short, her story serves as a beacon, a call to action to protect others from suffering the same fate. Ashley's legacy is one of resilience and hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, love and determination can create a path toward healing and justice.